Hello, everyone, and welcome tonight. My name is Glenn Rawson. It is Sunday night, July 20th, 2025. I welcome you, and I thank you for joining me. This week is going to be commemorating some significant events in church history, particularly the summer of 1833. And for whatever reason, I don't know why, I have felt impressed this week that most of the stories I will share with you tonight come from one specific moment of church history. Stories that I think we should all remember, all of which teach us inspiring moral principles. So that will be most of my stories tonight, all but one, actually. Before we get into that, I just wanted to let you know that for any of you that are interested, the temple trip that Dennis Lyman and I are going to take, we have postponed that until this fall. That trip and the other one going on the trail from Nauvoo to the Salt Lake Valley, those two trips are coming up this fall when we've got just a little bit more time and we're not as pressed as we are right now. The temple trip is the one I told you about where it's going to be called the Temple and Tabernacle Trips across Utah. And we'll take in Logan, St. George, Manti, and then the Provo City Center Temple, which used to be the Tabernacle. That's going to be our trip. All of us on a bus, laughing, talking, sharing stories, all of that is going to be coming up in September. And then also, in addition, is the trail trip, the trip across from Nauvoo to the Salt Lake Valley. That trail is sacred. It's a special story, which I'm afraid not enough of us know and really comprehend. Therefore, Dennis and I are going to take another bus of people from Nauvoo to Salt Lake across the trail. And we'll understand what really happened and why those pioneers were pioneers, why they were out there in the first place. This is something you've got to see. If you've never seen the trail, if you've never stood in the ruts of those trails that are still there after more than 150 years, if you've never stood on the ground where your fathers and mothers once walked on their quest for Zion, oh, you're missing something. Come with me this September. For more information, go to historyofthesaints.org, or you can give me a call. Call me, 208-589-7671. I'll put you in touch with the right people. And then one more thing. You've seen some stuff going on Facebook about the title of this new book. We have this ongoing discussion going on in our office about how that book should be titled. Should we title it Prayer Brings Miracles or Prayer Nigh Unto Miracles? Well, we have a little campaign going on. Before we actually print that book, we'd really like to know what kind of a title we should give it. So we're down to that. Prayer Nigh to Miracles or Prayer Brings Miracles. If you haven't seen it, the little discussion, the debate, if you will, going on Facebook, go check it out at Glenn Rawson Stories on Facebook. I'd love to have you weigh in and tell me what you think. The book is a collection of stories sent in mostly by you. Stories about prayer and the miracles that come because of prayer. Stories about how prayer opens up the heavens and invites the tender mercies of God. It's a powerful book. The stories are yours. Okay. Tonight, as I've said so many times in the past, would you leave me a comment? Tell me who's watching, how many of you there are, and where you're watching from. I read all the comments. I emphasize that. I read all the comments. If you'd like to talk to me, leave me a comment. I will read it. I can't respond to all of them, but I will read it. And one last thing, I guess, thank you to all of you. We're closing in on 25,000 free subscribers to the weekly stories. I'm grateful to you for taking those stories and using them in talks and in lessons and giving them to friends, using them in your ministering assignments. Thank you. And if there's anyone else that would like to be a free subscriber, go to glennrawsonstories.com. There is no obligation. There is no cost. Those stories will be sent in video and printed format right to you. You'll get a YouTube story, inspirational, motivational story every week. So to all of those of you who are free subscribers, thank you. And to all those of you that are VIPs, thank you especially, because you're putting money into this work to help us. And it's a lot of work and requires a lot of people. So thank you. I invite you to pray tonight, to let the Spirit of the Lord be here as I share these stories with you. This first one is the only one that does not tie to the theme of 1833. This story is, a leftover from my recent trip to Alaska. And I don't know, maybe this story will be as boring as watching grass grow, but to me, when I first learned this, it was, intriguing, exciting. There was a time in this world when the sea otter was one of the most sought after and valuable animals in the world. Why? Because of its skin. The fur of the sea otter is unlike any other. 1 million hairs per square inch of otter hide makes it one of the most dense and luxurious furs of any fur-bearing animal. Consequently, it was highly prized, very valuable, and highly sought after, especially among nobility and elites who could afford it. And one of the places where it was most valuable in the 1700s, in the 1800s, was in China. A single fur at the beginning of the 18th century, or in the late 18th century rather, could bring $100, which in that day was the equivalent of a year's wages for a man. Consequently, that drove independent and intrepid men to seek further and further into the Arctic North, looking for this valuable animal, the sea otter. Independent trappers actually pushed across Siberia until eventually they found their way to the coast of Alaska, where they found a new and fresh supply of sea otter and other valuable animals. It was so valuable that the Russians established the Russian-American Company, which reached all the way from Sitka, Alaska on the north, clear down to the coast of Northern California. Alaska was a very valuable colony to the Russians, so much so that the control of Alaska came under the command of the Tsar himself. But then, by the 19th century, particularly around the 1840s, the supply of sea otter had radically diminished. Their populations were decimated. The demand for pelts began to dwindle. And suddenly, Alaska was no longer that valuable to the Russians anymore. And then it became a critical situation. The Crimean War between the British and the Russians. Russians lost. They were deeply in debt. They really needed money. And Alaska had become a great wilderness burden. Why? Because it covered so much land, 585,000 square miles of land. That's difficult to govern. Moreover, on the Alaska Peninsula, the British were just over the mountains in Canada, and they could just come over the mountains and take Alaska away from the Russians. They had to do something. So in 1867, their ambassador engaged in negotiations with American William H. Seward, Secretary of State, and a deal was struck in which the Russians would sell Alaska to their friends, the United States, for $7.2 million. That deal was struck at 4 o'clock in the morning. And what that amounted to is we would receive Alaska paying, about the equivalent of 2 cents an acre for Alaska. But the Russians saw it as a win. Not only did they get much needed money, but they got something for Alaska instead of losing it in a war to the British. They were happy. William H. Seward, the Secretary of State, had a remarkable vision of the United States, something like manifest destiny. He saw the United States expanding its borders from east to west, from south to north. But the rest of America, they didn't see it that way. The Russians, they were happy. They gave their ambassador a $25,000 bonus and a comfortable retirement, and he went off in fine style. But in America, Seward was ridiculed. They called Alaska Seward's Folly, Wall Russia, or Seward's Icebox. No one took Alaska that serious or considered it of any value. Well, from 1867 to 1896, I suppose that's what happened. But then in 1896, gold was discovered just over the border in the Yukon, and then again in Fairbanks, and then again gold was discovered in Nome in 1899, and other mineral discoveries came after that. All of a sudden, Alaska had some value. Then came World War II, and June 1942, and the Japanese invaded and bombed the Aleutian Islands. For the first time since the War of 1812, a foreign power was sitting on American territory. Not only that, they were right on our doorstep. And all of a sudden, Alaska was recognized for its critical strategic value during the war. And military installations sprung up immediately. The Alcan Highway was constructed for that purpose in a virtual blur of activity. And as time passed, in 1940s and 50s, Alaska became recognized for its valuable, vast tracts of forest, and then its fisheries, and so much. And then who can forget? Alaska was still a territory, valuable, but maybe not that valuable. And then came the 1950s, and all of a sudden the Russians weren't our friends anymore. They were our enemies. It was the Cold War and threats of nuclear annihilation. And our foremost enemy in the Cold War, the Soviet Union, was only 55 miles away across the Bering Strait from American soil. Now, Alaska was valuable. And very quickly, Alaska became the 49th state entitled to the full protection rights of every other American citizen and the full exploitation of the United States government and military. Well, Alaska continued to increase in value. And then 1968 came the discovery of oil in Prudhoe Bay. Not just oil, but the largest oil field in North America. And who can calculate the amount of wealth that has flowed to Alaska and to America just from that one oil field? And all I've been talking about is just the material wealth of Alaska. oil, forest, minerals, and so much more. But what about the beautiful, scenic wildness of Alaska? John Muir, the eminent early 20th century naturalist, would refer to Alaska as, quote, fresh from the hand of God, a place like unto Eden for him, he would say. No one properly informed today can or would ever say that Alaska, the 49th state, is worthless. Now, all of that is history. You can look it up. It's all there. But I don't tell you that story to give you a history lesson. William H. Seward, the man who negotiated the purchase of Alaska, once said, and I quote, "The American people must learn to look far off into the future." End of quote. We have all been blessed, me especially, because Seward could see off into the future. That story, what I've just told you, struck me forcefully because of what Seward said. Here's my point to you. To all those of you now under the sound of my voice, take the long view. Look far off into the future. There is, brothers and sisters, a glorious kingdom of infinite wealth and value and beauty waiting for us. Some call it heaven. Our Heavenly Father has promised us all that He has if we will just stay the course. Stay the course. Keep the long view. Go to church every week. Pray. Read the scriptures. Serve in the lowliest of callings, no matter what they are. Do it faithfully. Do the mundane with a view to the glorious. It's all going to be worth it. There will come a moment, and I promise you this for all of us, when we will realize the inestimable worth of the long view and life of faithfulness. All right. My theme for tonight, I don't know why, but I have felt impressed to take a moment in history and tell you stories from it. This is so important to me because at one point it had so much meaning that Dennis and I wrote a book about it. It's called War on the Saints. There have been moments in the history of this church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, when our people have borne stunning persecution. They have endured indescribable hardship and sacrifice for their faith, put upon them by the enemies of God. These next 6 stories are a glimpse into a single chapter of what makes us the people we are by the things we've endured. First story. The love that God has for us, Christ's love, is called charity. And if we don't have that same kind of love for God, for Christ, and for others that they have for us, well, then what are we? We're nothing. But with that, with charity, we can go live with them because we're like them, fit subjects for a heavenly kingdom filled with people who love as Christ does. So why is this virtue, charity, so highly valued by the gods? Well, I think this story illustrates why. July 20th, 1833, Independence, Missouri. A mob of some 400 to 500 men angrily decided that they did not like the Mormons who had taken residence in their county, Jackson County, Missouri, and that those Mormons must leave. They drafted a resolution over the signature of the leading citizens of the county, and then sent 12 men out to present their demands to the Mormon leaders. Among them, Edward Partridge, William W. Phelps, Oliver Cowdery, and others. Well, upon receiving those requests, the church leaders asked for 3 months to consider the demands and decide a course. That was denied. They then asked for 10 days but that too was denied. They were given 15 minutes to decide what to do with 1,200 people, their property and possessions, and how to get them out of the county. The demand was outrageous, illegal, and unreasonable. So the church leaders just cut off the negotiations. That was it. The delegation went back and informed them that that was the answer of the church leaders. Then they divided up into mobs and set out to destroy. They went first to the church-owned printing office, broke down the door, and dragged Sally Phelps and her children out into the street. They then tossed out the press out the second-story window, along with all of the Phelps family possessions, and then began to tear the building down, beginning at the gable end, and buried in the process 2 of the Phelps children. The mob then went for the Gilbert and Whitney church-owned store and began demolishing it and scattering the goods. Only when Gilbert promised to be out in 3 days did the mob desist in their actions. And then with yelling, cursing, and flaring tempers, the mob went in search of church leaders. They burst into the home of Edward Partridge, and while his family watched, laid hands on him and dragged him to the public square of Independence. With the mob of more than 200 angry people surrounding them, Edward Partridge and young Charles Allen were given an ultimatum that they must renounce the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith, the church, and leave the county. Bishop Partridge refused to renounce, stating, quote, "If I must suffer for my religion, it is no more than others have done before me." He then declared that he was not conscious of having injured anyone in the county. Therefore, he said, "I could not consent to leave it." End quote. Well, that infuriated the mob, and they pushed the 2 men to the ground and began to strip off their clothes with the intent of tarring and feathering both of them. Bishop Partridge asked for the dignity of keeping his pants on, but that was about all. They poured tar, mingled with pearl ash, a flesh-eating acid, over his body, and then covered him with feathers. Partridge stood there, the only part of him not covered, his face. He stood there without struggle, without retaliation, without any kind of recrimination, as they brutalized him. He said later, "I bore my abuse with so much resignation and meekness that it appeared to astound the multitude, who permitted me to retire in silence, many looking very solemn, their sympathies having been touched as I thought. As to myself," Partridge said, "I was so filled with the Spirit and love of God that I had no hatred toward my persecutors or anyone else." There it is. That's why the love of God is so essential if we would have the kingdom of heaven, because that's how God loves. Imagine what would happen if God had a temper today. Anyone who crossed him, blasphemed him, or disobeyed his commandments, if he was a hothead with a temper, would you survive? I wouldn't. God is patient, forgiving, forbearing. He is just, and there will come recompense. but he is patient. That's charity. That's what Bishop Partridge demonstrated. That's why it's the greatest of all virtues. Thank goodness that only people like Edward Partridge will dwell in the kingdom of God with God. And as for that good bishop, he wasn't done yet. He would go on and offer himself as a ransom for those beleaguered people in Jackson County. And eventually, he'd stay with the church until he wore out his life and died a premature death in Nauvoo. That's charity. I want to be more like Bishop Partridge. Next story. This is another experience that comes out of that same period of time, July 20th, 1833, when the mobs took the law into their own hands and determined that they would drive members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints out of Jackson County. It was a time of unspeakable terror for the saints. Among them was another church leader, soon would be an apostle. His name was William E. McLellin. He experienced firsthand the fear of the mobs. Decades later, McLellin would write in detail of his experience. He said, quote, "In 1833, when mobbing reigned triumphant in Jackson County, Missouri, I and Oliver Cowdery fled from our homes for fear of personal violence on Saturday, the 20th of July. The mob dispersed, agreeing to meet again on the next Tuesday, and they offered $80 reward for anyone who would deliver Cowdery or McLellin in Independence on Tuesday. On Monday," he said, "I slipped down into the Whitmer's settlement, and there in the lonely woods," hiding out, "there in the lonely woods, I met with David Whitmer and Oliver Cowdery, and I said to them," quote, "Brethren," now remember who he's talking to, David Whitmer, Oliver Cowdery, "Brethren, I have never seen an open vision in my life, but you men say you have, and therefore you positively know. Now you know that our lives are in danger every hour if the mob can only catch us. Tell me, in the fear of God, is that Book of Mormon true?" And then William continued the narrative. "Cowdery looked at me with solemnity depicted in his face and said, 'Brother William, God sent his holy angel to declare the truth of the translation of it to us, and therefore we know. And though the mob kill us, yet we must die, declaring its truth.' David said, 'Oliver has told you the truth, for we could not be deceived. I most truly declare to you its truth.' Said I, McLellin, said I, 'Boys, I believe you. I can see no object for you to tell me falsehood now when our lives are endangered.'" End quote. Oh, my word. Isn't that powerful? McLellin would later leave the church and become, as it were, an enemy of the church and of the prophet Joseph Smith. Yet he would consider the Book of Mormon precious, the apple of his eye, and a truth that he could and would never deny for the rest of his days. Now, dear friends, in all practicality, religion aside, the Book of Mormon now is before the world. And for anyone who will take the time to examine it carefully, not just read it, but examine it carefully, they will find not only a veritable cloud of witnesses about the book, but within the book, proving, and affirming from every direction that indeed the Book of Mormon is a testimony of Jesus Christ, and it is true. Next story. I mentioned to you earlier, the mob went after the printing house. This story is pertaining to that. Mary Elizabeth Rollins was among those living in Jackson County, Missouri in the summer of 1833. She was 14, 15 years old. She tells of her firsthand experience learning about the revelations of the prophet Joseph Smith that were soon to be published in the Book of Commandments. She said this, quote, "One evening the brethren came to Uncle Sidney Gilbert's house, to converse upon the revelations that had not been printed as yet. Few had looked upon them, for they were in large sheets, not folded. They spoke of them with such reverence as coming from the Lord. They felt to rejoice that, that they were counted worthy to be the means of publishing them for the benefit of the whole world. While talking, they were filled with the Spirit and spoke in tongues. I was called upon to interpret it. I felt the spirit of it in a moment," she said. She's 15. Well, those revelations were in the process of being printed July 20th, 1833, when mob violence against the church broke out. Mary Elizabeth relates the following of what happened that day at the printing office. Quote, "The mob renewed their efforts again by tearing down the printing office, a 2-story building, and driving Brother Phelps's family out of the lower part of the house and putting their things in the street. They brought out some large sheets of paper and said, 'Here are the Mormon commandments.' My sister Caroline and myself were in a corner of a fence watching them when they spoke of the commandments. I was determined to have some of them. Sister said if I went to get any of them, she would go too, but she said, 'They will kill us.' While their backs were turned," meaning the mob, "while their backs were turned, prying out the gable end of the house, we went and got our arms full and were turning away when some of the mob saw us and called on us to stop. But we ran as fast as we could. 2 of them started after us. Seeing a gap in the fence, we entered into a large cornfield, laid the papers on the ground, and hid them with our persons. The corn was from 5 to 6 feet high and very thick. They hunted around considerable and came very near, but they did not find us. After we satisfied ourselves that they had given up the search for us, we tried to find our way out of the field. The corn was so high, we couldn't see where to go. Looking up, I saw trees that had been girdled to kill them. Soon we came to an old log stable, which looked as though it had not been used for years. Sister Phelps and children were carrying in brush and piling it up on one side of the barn to lay her beds on. She asked me what I had. I told her. She then took them from us, which made us feel very bad. They got them bound in small books and sent me one, which I prized very highly." End of quote. That small book of 1833 would be bound, what there was, and would become the Book of Commandments. Today, one of the rarest and most valuable of early Latter-day Saint books. But again, on another point, just imagine today, July 2025, July 20th, actually, 2025, today. Imagine valuing the revelations of the Doctrine and Covenants given through the prophet Joseph Smith so much that you count it an honor to hold the book, and you are willing to risk your life for them, indeed, to die, to keep it. Perhaps if more of us knew by the Spirit what Mary Elizabeth knew, well, that is precisely what we would do. Let's take a break. How are you? I was talking to my team earlier this week. I wish there was a way I could reach right through and connect with each one of you, bear my testimony to your face and tell you I love you and I love the Lord. I just want to help. Next year, with Fun for Less tours, we are going back to Alaska. I'm not sure if it will be me or Karen that will take a group to Alaska, but we are going. And after all that I've said about Alaska in the last couple of weeks, I'm inviting you to come. It will be the adventure of a lifetime. Just ask those who came with us. Also, just announced, we have now entered the year of America 250. 250 years since the Declaration of Independence, or will be on July 4th, 2026. And because of that, Fun for Less Tours is taking a couple of tours, one with Michael Wilcox and Jeff Lawson, and maybe the other one with me in September, October. If so, I'm inviting you to come. Do you love America? Well, go and learn more and feel that love even deeper. If you're interested, you can either go to funforlesstours.com or you can call them at 801-619-1022. And lastly, for this break, do you have any inspiring stories? I keep asking, but nobody's sending me anything. I'm not seeing it. Are there inspiring stories that have converted you or your pioneer fathers or those you know and love? If they're true and if they're written down, would you honor me and send them to me so that I can build faith in others? Just a thought. Glenn at glennrawsonstories.com. Continuing on now. On the 20th of July, mob violence broke out against the saints. The stories I've told you are about that. Well, there was a very uneasy truce from July 20th up into the end of October, while the saints tried to figure out what to do. But when they were not gone by the end of October, mob violence broke out again. The next three stories take place the end of October and the first week of November, 1833. They are once again about the persecution our people endured, but the glorious things that were revealed because of that persecution. First story. Philo Dibble was born in Massachusetts and joined the church October 16, 1830 in Kirtland, Ohio. He was part of the congregation there before the prophet Joseph arrived in Kirtland in March 1831. Philo recounts the following. He said, now this is in the fall of 1833. On one occasion, Joseph Smith was preaching in Kirtland sometime in the fall of 1833. Quite a number of persons were present who did not belong to the church. And one man, more bitter and skeptical than others, made note with pencil and paper of a prophecy uttered on that occasion wherein Joseph said, quote, 40 days shall not pass and the stars shall fall from heaven. Well, that's quite a prophecy. The man wrote it down with the attitude of skepticism and unbelief. Well, To him, it was sure evidence that Joseph Smith was a false prophet, and he was going to prove it. Well, Philo continues his narrative. On the 39th day after the utterance of that prophecy, a brother in the church by the name of Joseph Hancock, who is, Philo said, yet living in Payson, Utah, and another brother went out hunting game and got lost. They wandered about in the night until they found themselves where? At the home of this unbeliever who produced the note of Joseph Smith's prophecy and asked Brother Joseph Hancock what he thought of his prophet now that 39 days had passed and the prophecy was not fulfilled. Brother Hancock was unmoved, Philo says, and quietly remarked, "There is one night left of the time, and if Joseph said so, the stars will certainly fall tonight. This prophecy will all be fulfilled," Hancock said. Well, the matter weighed upon the mind of Brother Hancock, who watched that night, and it proved to be the historical one known in the world as, quote, the night of the falling stars. Brother Hancock stayed that night at the house of the skeptical unbeliever, as it was too far from home to return by night. And in the midst of the falling stars, Hancock went out and saw it, went to the door of his host, called him out to witness what he had thought was impossible, the most improbable thing that could happen, especially as that was the last night in which Joseph Smith could be saved from the condemnation of being a false prophet. And as the unbeliever stepped out, the whole heavens were lit up with the falling of meteors, and the countenance of this unbeliever was plainly seen and watched by Brother Hancock, who said he turned pale as death and spoke not a word. After that event, Philo says, the unbeliever sought the company of any Latter-day Saint he could. He even enticed Mormon children to keep him company at his house. Not long afterwards, he sent for Joseph and Hiram to visit him, which they did, but evidently it did not take, for he never joined the church. That famous night of the falling stars, later known as the Leonid meteor showers, occurred in November, the first week of November, 1833. The world saw it and wondered. But for the Latter-day Saints, who suffered as refugees, driven, mobbed, whipped, beaten, and murdered by their enemies in Jackson County, that night of falling stars was seen as a sign by the saints of God, refugees, that God was watching over them and was very near. Next story, again from Philo Dibble. And I'm going to quote this story in honor of my late friend, the historian William G. Hartley. He wrote this story, and I want to read it just as he quoted it. In late 1833, certain local citizens in Jackson County had determined to drive the Mormons from the county by whatever means necessary. Hence, on November 4th, 1833, a large band of Missourians captured the Mormon ferry at the Big Blue River. Riders scattered several saints, including David Whitmer, who rushed to Kaw Township to recruit help. In response, 30 armed men jogged toward the ferry. They reached Christian Whitmer's house at sunset, where mobbers were bullying him. Firing commenced. Joseph Knight Jr., working at his mill a mile away, could hear the shooting. In the skirmish, 2 Missourians and several horses were killed. A Mormon, Andrew Barber, the first man in this dispensation, was martyred for the truth's sake. Brother was shot. Philo Dibble was shot in the stomach. A veteran doctor checked Brother Dibble and declared his wounds would be fatal. Eluding a mob near the house where Brother Dibble lay, Newell slipped inside the house and went to Philo Dibble's bed. Newell said, "I drew the bed curtains with one hand and laid the other upon his head praying secretly in his behalf. Then Newell left immediately to avoid the mob. The next day, business took Newell 10 miles from the place, where to his surprise, Newell said, "I met Brother Dibble making his escape from the county." How could that be? 1 minute he's critically wounded and expected to die, and the next day, he's 10 miles away trying to escape the county. When he asked him that question, Philo Dibble said the following to Newell, quote, "He told me that as soon as I placed my hand upon his head, the pain and soreness seemed gradually to move as before a power driving it, until in a few minutes it left his body. He then discharged about a gallon of putrid matter and the balls and pieces of clothing which had passed into his body." End of quote. Philo Dibble describes this remarkable moment of healing and adds details that Newell didn't give. Philo said, quote, "After the surgeon left me, Brother Newell Knight came to see me. He sat on the right side of my bed and laid his hands on my head, but never spoke. I felt the Spirit resting upon me at the crown of my head before his hand touched me, and I knew immediately that I was going to be healed. It seemed to form like a ring under the skin and followed down my body. When the ring came to the wound, another ring formed around the first bullet hole, and also the second and the third. Then the ring formed on each shoulder and on each hip and followed down to my fingers and toes and left me." Philo said, "I immediately arose and discharged 3 quarts of blood or more, with some pieces of my clothes that had been driven into my body by the bullets. I then dressed myself and went outdoors. From that time, not a drop of blood came from me, and I never afterwards felt the slightest pain or inconvenience from any wound, except that I was somewhat weak from the loss of blood." End quote. Brother Dibble lived on for many years, quoting Hartley. Brother Dibble lived on for many years. Of this event, Newell recorded this in his diary, quote, "Oh, how our hearts rejoiced and gave thanks to that God who had heard and answered the secret prayer of his servant, although in the midst of an infuriated mob." End of quote. I love that story. It comes from the book Stand By My Servant Joseph, the story of the Joseph Knight family by William G. Hartley. One last story. This is again November 1833, the mobbing and driving out of Jackson County, Missouri. During that time of intense persecution, November 1833, Mary Elizabeth Rollins, she was 15, and she watched all that happened. The first mobbings, as I said, had come in July, and the final driving from the county came in November 1833. It was of the later events in November that she records this in her autobiography. She said, quote, "After enduring all manner of grievances, we were driven from the county. While we were camped on the banks of the Missouri River, waiting to be ferried over, they found there was not enough money to take all over. 1 or 2 families must be left behind, and the fear was that if left, they would be killed. So, some of the brethren by the name of Higby thought they would try and catch some fish. Perhaps the ferryman would take them. They put out their lines in the evening. It rained all night and most of the next day. When they took in their lines, they found 2 or 3 small fish, and a catfish that weighed 14 pounds. On opening it, what was their astonishment to find 3 bright silver half-dollars, just the amount needed to pay for taking their team over the river. This was considered a miracle and caused great rejoicing among us. My dear friends, when you know the right people, we live in an age of miracles where these kinds of things are common. Moreover, it would seem that when God's people have their backs against the water, helpless and trapped, both literally and figuratively, that He is nigh, He is watching, and His tender mercies and miracles will follow to aid His people, and they will come away knowing that God is with them fighting their battles. I suspect, and I anticipate, and the Spirit bears witness, you and I, before we pass this scene, may get the opportunity to endure persecution and find out for ourselves how much God's mercies are brought forth by the extremities caused by men and devils. But in the meantime, enjoy your peace. Good night, and God bless.